Hey everybody, this is a piece by Riccardo Bellofiore. Um, I'm not really actually quite sure what this is. It seems it's a guest editor's introduction uh, to a volume or an issue of International Journal of Political Economy. Um, I believe, I'm not exactly sure what this article is about. But it's about, what the proper title of this issue was, but it's about Marxian theory, the debates on Marxian theory in Italy, which I think is very interesting. So I'm going to read this for that purpose. So here we are. Riccardo Bellofiore, guest editor's introduction. The essays collected in this issue of the International Journal of Political Economy belong to a peculiar phase of the Italian debate about Marxian theory. With the exception of the last contribution, they were all written during the 1980s. They center on one, a reading of the theory of value as a macroeconomic picture of the class conflict between capital and wage labor, rather than as a microeconomic analysis of relative prices. Two, a reading in which money is first of all money capital buying labor power on the labor market, and then allowing a command over living labor in production rather than money as general equivalent on the commodity market. To help the reader understand these papers and to clarify their novelty, they must be set against a twofold background. On the one hand, the rise and fall of Marxism as critical political economy in Italy during the 1960s and 1970s. On the other, the international debate about the so-called transformation problem. At the time when Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities appeared in 1960, the relation between value and price was interpreted along the lines of what might be called a, quote, received opinion, end quote, dating from the 1940s, according to which Marx determined capitalist exchange ratios through a sequence of successive approximations. The proportionality of prices to values, that is, exchange values, is the first approximation, embraced by Marx in the first volume of Capital. Let me duplicate this to get to the footnotes. Footnote. I here use interchangeably the words, quote, values, quote, exchange values, quote, labor values, and, quote, simple prices, as the form absolute value takes on the commodity market in exchange with money. This value form is what is transformed into prices of production in Capital Volume 3, Chapter 9. End footnote. The proportionality of prices to values is an imperfect approximation to full-fledged competitive capitalism, as Marx well knew. In fact, if relative prices were equal to the relative labor content in commodities, it would be impossible for individual capitals of the same magnitude, but different organic composition, to achieve the same rate of profit. This imperfection, according to this traditional Marxism, accounts for the search for a second approximation to the determination of capitalist exchange ratios, the one Marx sketched out in the third volume of Capital with his price of production theory. The justification for this sequence of approximations lies in the fact that the distribution of the social product between capital and labor can be adequately represented by a reasoning in terms of exchange value. In other words, the transformation of exchange values into production prices has no feedback effect on the capital-labor exchange ratio. The chief representatives of this reading of Marxian theory were Paul M. Sweezy, Ronald L. Meek, and Maurice H. Daub. See Daub 1940, Sweezy 1942, Meek 1956. Meek and Daub in particular welcomed Sraffa's book as providing the long-awaited and rigorous solution to the transformation problem. In the introduction to an Italian edition of Capital in 1964, Maurice Daub repeated that in Marx's theory of value, it was possible to detect, quote, two levels of approximation or two stages in the analysis, end quote. In the first stage, that is, the first volume of Capital, commodities are thought to be exchanged in proportion to commodities' embodied labor. Quote, what this theory of value essentially did was to explain conditions of exchange in terms of conditions of production, end quote. In the second stage, that is, the price theory is found in the third volume of Capital, commodity exchange takes place through prices of production, that is, through ruling prices that diverge from exchange values. The argument according to which conditions of production were the factor determining conditions of exchange was attacked by neoclassicals who pointed out the quote, great contradiction, end quote, between values and prices. An important person there would be Eugen von Bombawerk. I think that's his name. I know it's Bombawerk, but I think that's his first name, Eugen von Bombawerk. Anyway, but I have that on this channel if you're curious about that. How is it possible to maintain the theory of surplus value if the second stage of analysis, prices, could not be deduced from the first, values? How is it possible to maintain the theory of surplus value if the second stage of the analysis, prices, could not be deduced from the first, values? Dobbs' answer was that the equations forming the core of Sraffa's book, where methods of production and wage were taken as the givens from which prices of production and the rates of profit were set simultaneously, implicitly showed the soundness of the logical structure of Marx's work. This opinion is, in fact, quite dubious, since the idea of the two approximations is foreign to production of commodities. The book, Production of Commodities. This opinion is, in fact, quite dubious, since the idea of two approximations is foreign to Sraffa's Production of Commodities. There is obviously no need to start from exchange values in order to determine production prices. The latter can indeed be calculated from the same data from which the former are derived. The debate in the 1960s and the 1970s evidenced the failure of the traditional Marxist reading of Marx. Two justifications can be given for such a judgment. The first refers to the lively Italian debate of the late 1960s and early 1970s, which centered on the relationship between the twin categories of abstract labor and value. The second refers to the, quote, Marx after Sraffa, end quote, international controversy in the late 1970s. Here I shall survey the former, since the latter is well known to the English-speaking audience. The Italian Marxist economists, the followers as well as the critics of Sraffa, were deeply influenced by the philosopher Lucio Colletti's path-breaking rereading of Marx's labor theory of value. I have a piece by Lucio Colletti on this channel about Second International Marxism. It's not related to this. I don't think it's related. Maybe it has some comments to make on value theory, but I don't think it does. All seem to agree with the view that abstract labor as the substance of value had to be interpreted as the labor really separated in exchange from the subjectivity of individual workers who actually performed that labor in production. This alienated labor becomes the independent subject dominating human beings, who are reduced to this alienated labor's predicates, the mundane equivalent of Hegel's real hypostases. As a consequence, labor producing for exchange loses all concreteness and only counts as the quantitatively determined expenditure of labor without quality. Value is that kind of generic or abstract wealth that closely reflects the, quote, pure and simple labor, end quote, producing value. Abstract labor and value are then the same thing. Abstract labor considered as the activities whose result is value. When labor is alienated, labor's product cannot but be value. Value resolves itself entirely into objectified abstract labor. Among the young Marxist followers of Sraffa, among them Ferdinando Vianello is the most interesting. Try to extend this interpretation into an analytic combination of Marx and Sraffa. Let me see if I can find anything on this person. I'm not seeing anything on Italian Wikipedia, so moving on. Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this person. Anyway, in Vianello's view, commodities are objectified abstract labor before and independent of exchange and the setting of individual prices. Thus, it is always possible, 1. To bring back the social produce to total direct labor, 2. To define as necessary labor that part returning to workers, 3. To define the residual part as surplus labor. This conclusion, however, was harshly challenged by Claudio Napoleoni. It is true Napoleoni conceded that one cannot scientifically understand capitalism without some notion of absolute value. However, this concept, namely the magnitude of value as the result of the amount of abstract labor embodied in its production prior to final exchange on the commodity market, must extend into the category of price of production, and this prolongation cannot be provided by Sraffa's prices. The reason is that arguments like that proposed by Vianello leave out the category of exchange value, namely the ratio between magnitudes of value or, quote, simple, end quote, prices proportional to embodied labors. Exchange value is the, quote, necessary form of appearance, end quote, of, parenthesis, absolute, end parenthesis, value. It is then the essential mediation for the determination of prices, parenthesis, of production, end parenthesis. Marx's transformation cannot be split into a, quote, qualitative, end quote, analysis of value production on the one hand, and a, quote, quantitative, end quote, analysis of the distribution of that given value on the other, without some bridge connecting the two dimensions within the labor theory of value. It may be worth remembering that Lucio Colletti cited Claudio Napoleoni against the young Sraffans, and that both these authors strongly criticized the two approximations' view. Labor values, far from being the first approximation to prices, are the true outcome of capitalist commodity production as it necessarily manifests itself in general exchange. The above conclusion is strengthened in Napoleoni by the consideration that abstract labor, which Colletti deduces from general exchange as such, that is, from the ex post indirect socialization through the mediation of the market of immediately private labors, is also deduced by Marx as the living labor of the wage worker, that is, from capitalist production. General commodity exchange and capitalist exchange are one and the same thing in Napoleoni's Marx, so that the production of value is at the same time production of surplus value. From this perspective, money cannot be considered a mere means of exchange intervening after production, through circulation to give a simple monetary veil to general indirect barter. Instead, abstract wealth is the very product of abstract labor, parenthesis, absolute, and parenthesis, value, ideal money. It is made visible through the realization of ideal money into an actual general equivalent embodied in a special commodity distinguished from all others. Between 1974 and 1976, Lucio Colletti deserted Marxism. Lucio Colletti began to see the notion of abstract labor as too tightly connected to that side of Marx indebted to Hegel's logic of the contradiction, in contrast with that other side for which Marx could be seen as the heir of classical political economy. If value falls off into a parenthesis bad and parenthesis metaphysics, and price into science, there could no longer be any mediation between them. Science cannot be based on dialectics, Colletti claimed. Another important event in Italian Marxism was the publication in 1976 of a book by Marco Lippi, another follower of Sraffa, which was promptly translated into English. Yeah, I think this book is, Value and Naturalism in Marx by Marco Lippi. That's published with Verso. And the description for that book is, when value and naturalism, and the book's called Value and Naturalism in Marx. I don't know if I said that already. When Value and Naturalism in Marx was first published in English in 1979, recent controversies in socialist economic theory have been concentrated on the tenability or untenability of Marx's labor theory of value. Marco Lippi's provocative book accepts the Sraffian correction of Marx's account of profits and prices, but goes on to ask the central question: why did Marx identify value with embodied labor time? The answer, Lippi argues, lies in a strong, though little discussed, naturalistic strain in Marx's thought. Through a novel analysis of the discussion of circulation cost in Volume 2 of Capital, Marco Lippi contends that Marx operated with a concept of, quote, production in general, end quote, as a relation of man to nature common to all forms of society, in which labor time appears as the sole real cost. It was this general conception of production, Lippi suggests, that underlay Marx's insistence that profits, interest, rent, and faux represent no more than a redistribution of a given total, the mass of surplus value, in a system in which total profit equaled total surplus value and total price total value. While Lippi rejects Marx's naturalistic identification of value with embodied labor time, Lippi claims that the account developed from it of the anarchy of the market, of commodity fetishism, and of the laws of motion of capitalism is in fact logically independent and retains all its empirical validity. Value and Naturalism in Marx, the work of one of the most outstanding younger economists in Italy, reveals the classic economic theory of historical materialism in quite a new light. Back to the text. In Lippi's opinion, the failure of the labor theory of value is caused by Marx's, quote, naturalism, end quote. Marx's idea that labor values are hidden behind prices. Marx's idea that labor values are hidden behind prices would be the direct consequence of the idea that abstract labor is the real cost of production, independent of abstract labor's historical and social determination. The connection of value to embodied labor would therefore show that behind value is a concept pertaining to general commodity exchange. We may detect another notion, abstract labor, pertaining to production as a meta-historical phenomenon. The failure of Marx's transformation shows that capitalism's, quote, historicity, end quote, is much deeper than Marx himself thought. Marco Lippi's book gave rise to a lively debate culminating in a conference at the University of Modena in February 1978. On this occasion, Napoleoni again took a different standpoint, at the same time changing his judgment about Marx and Sraffa. Napoleoni now fully agreed with the argument that, from a scientific point of view, Sraffa's conclusions are unexceptionable, thus retreating from his position in the early 1970s. He also conceded that the search for an alternative transformation procedure in which he engaged in previous years was nothing but a chimera. At the same time, while accepting the split proposed by Colletti between a scientist and a philosopher in Marx, Napoleoni found the philosopher the most interesting of the two for the understanding of capitalism. According to Napoleoni, abstract labor is not natural labor as in Lippi, but due to abstract labor's alienated nature, abstract labor is exactly the opposite of natural labor, the capitalist inversion of natural labor. Value theory is the instrument by which Marx develops a philosophical analysis of the alienation of human beings in capitalism as the result of a reification process, whereas price theory is the place for the scientific analysis of the relations among the reified products of that process. Marx means the inevitable break of the connection between the first, qualitative, and the secondary, quantitative dimension, because the reification process has revealed itself, it says titself, which is hilarious, It's a typo. That's very funny. Sorry, I have to reread that sentence. Sraffa means the inevitable break of the connection between the first qualitative and the second quantitative dimension, because the reification process has revealed itself to be so powerful to destroy any trace of the origin of economic magnitudes and the alienation of labor. However, the failure of Marx's value theory as a quantitative, scientific picture of capitalism may be fully understood only thanks to the same value theory, as the ontology presupposed by Marx, where abstract labor is understood as the inversion of human labor, the quote, essence and quote, of human beings, as in the Paris manuscripts. Napoleoni's turn amounted to dismissing the efforts of those who, though admitting analytical difficulties in Marx, still insisted on working within Marxian theory as critical political economy, where the qualitative and quantitative dimensions could not be separated. The discussion about Marx as an economist, therefore, seemed to be carried on between two positions only. On the one hand, the quote, tough, end quote, Marxists, for whom Marx had been misunderstood, not only by his opponents, but also by all his 20th century followers, so that what was needed was simply to recover the original position of the master, and on the other, the Sraffians, who argued that Sraffa's production of commodities allowed them to confirm most of Marx's insights without the labor theory of value. But the Marxists were increasingly marginalized in the universities, and the Sraffians were forced on the defensive by the revival of orthodox economics. The essays by Graziani and Missori, published between 1983 and 1986, as well as my own, co-authored with Riccardo Bellofiore, hitherto unpublished and ideally connected with the others, represent a minority position. Footnote. The papers by Augusto Graziani present an occasional foray into Marxian political economy by an author whose main theoretical interest in the last 20 years has been the theory of the monetary circuit. Whereas Marcello Missori is nowadays very critical of some aspects of his early Marxist writings and prefers to direct his theoretical efforts toward new Keynesian economics and the analysis of credit rationing. This notwithstanding, it is my opinion that their reading of the Marxian (abstract) labor theory of value as a monetary macro approach is still a research project worth pursuing. End footnote. To evaluate the distinctive features of this alternative approach, it is worth briefly recalling some of the developments of international Marxist political economy during the 1980s and 1990s. The reference here is to all those readings of Marx's value theory which, by taking seriously the link between value and money, have tried to rescue its internal consistency. I'll take as representatives the so-called new interpretation by Duncan Foley and Dumenil. In a nutshell, the new interpretation of the transformation can be described as follows. Marx starts from the quote, postulate, end quote, that at the aggregate level, the new value added in a period, when exchanged on the market, merely expresses, in monetary form, the total direct labor employed in the production processes. Some scholars define this as Marx's, quote, law of value, end quote. It amounts to defining a strict correspondence between, on the one hand, the current labor originating in the social product, the current labor originating the social product, net of non-wage costs, and on the other, national income, that is, in a two-class society, the sum of wages and profits. Once it is assumed that there is nothing but labor behind the product of money value added, once it is assumed that there is nothing but labor behind the production of money value added, we may ask how much abstract labor is, quote, represented, end quote, in one monetary unit. The answer is provided by the notion of the, quote, value of money, end quote, which is defined in this theoretical approach as the ratio between the aggregate direct labor expended in production and the money value added. The value of money, then, is the quantity of labor objectified in the net product that can be, quote, commanded, end quote, on the market by one unit of money. It is the reciprocal of the, quote, monetary expression of labor, end quote, or the money value added per unit of social labor. Following the new interpretation, the, quote, postulate, end quote, implies that the only thing susceptible to change in the transformation of values into prices is the distribution of the given amount of social labor among the different commodities. The, quote, law of value, end quote, holds true whatever, quote, law of exchange, end quote, is adopted. Either the proportionality between prices and embodied labors, as in the first volume of Capital, or their systematic divergence, as for the prices of production in the third volume of Capital. Obviously, when prices are proportional to embodied labors, and henceforth when exchange values are the ruling prices, the quantity of money obtained on the market by every individual commodity will represent or, quote, command, end quote, a quantity of labor exactly equal to that embodied in the commodity itself. On the contrary, when prices diverge from exchange values, the quantity of labor represented in, or, quote, commanded, end quote, by the money obtained in exchange by every individual commodity must be different from the labor required to produce it. The next crucial step of this reading of Marx consists of defining the, quote, value of labor power, end quote. This is no longer interpreted as the labor, quote, congealed, end quote, in the subsistence wage bundle, but rather as the labor represented by the money wage. It is calculated by multiplying the money wage by the value of money, thus determining how much social labor, quote, goes back, end quote, to workers, a quantity that may well diverge from the labor embodied in the wage goods actually bought. Thanks to the possibility provided by the value of money to translate monetary magnitudes in labor quantities, the value of labor power becomes evidently just another name for the share of money wages within money income. Such an approach makes it easy to achieve results similar to Marx's. Indeed, by interpreting the equality between the sum of values and the sum of prices as the equality between the net product in values and in prices, while at the same time keeping constant in the transformation, not the real wage but the value of labor power as defined above, the other Marxian equality between the sum of profits and the sum of surplus values follows by definition. Total surplus value is the new money value added less variable capital, or minus variable capital. With respect to the it says minuend, I think it's a typo. I'm not sure what's supposed to be. With respect to the minuend, the new money value added resolves into the sum of wages and profits. The stipulation is that the labor represented in national income is equal to the labor required for its production, or in other words, that for the aggregate economy, the labor, quote, commanded, end quote, in exchange by the money value added and the labor embodied in the production of the net product are the same. With respect to the subtrahend variable capital, the definition of the value of labor power makes it nothing but the labor represented in, or, quote, commanded, end quote, by the money wage bill. The difference, the total surplus value, cannot but equal the labor represented in, or, quote, commanded, end quote, by money profits. The aggregate equivalence between profits and surplus value follows from the premises and definitions adopted by the, quote, new interpretation, end quote. For the sake of intellectual curiosity, one could continue the exercise of the tautological definitions and obtain both of Marx's equalities in the original form. To this end, two steps only are needed. First, Marx's constant capital must be reinterpreted among the lines of the new interpretation definition of variable capital as the labor represented in money capital buying means of production, and not as the labor required for their production. Parenthesis, see E.G. Moseley, 1994, but also Wolf, Roberts, and Colletti, 1982, in parenthesis. Second, the equality between the sum of values and the sum of prices must be restored to refer to gross output. However, once the new interpretation's postulate is granted, the former step automatically gives way to the latter. All the shares among which the total value produced is to be divided. that is, constant capital, variable capital, and the surplus value, are now interpreted as the labor represented in the three monetary, quote, segments, end quote, in which the total value is resolved. The labor represented in the net product is stipulated to come from the objectification of living labor, since the value of the means of production is now defined as equal to their price. The value of gross output, parenthesis, the value of net product plus the value of constant capital, in parenthesis, must be identical with its price, parenthesis, the price of net product plus the price of constant capital, in parenthesis. But how do these new interpretations of Marxian value theory respond to the issues debated in Italy in the early 1970s? Compared with interpretations such as Dobbs', unquestionable progress has been made, since the notions of value and money have been made inseparable. Value is the mean term between the labor-producing value. Value is the mean term between the labor-producing value, parenthesis, according to the, quote, law of value, end quote, and parenthesis, and the money representing value into the price form, parenthesis, following various alternative, quote, laws of exchange, end quote, and parenthesis. The monetary nature of general exchange imposes from the start the introduction of the concept of price, whose standard is the monetary unit, as distinct from the concept of parenthesis absolute and parenthesis value, whose measure is labor time, whether prices correspond or not to exchange values. The two approximations argument, therefore, is abandoned and replaced by one whereby, quote, simple, end quote, prices and production prices are only two among the many possible expressions of the price form. By the same token, however, the category of exchange value loses again. For the new interpretation, as for the young Italian Marxist followers of Sraffa in the early 1970s, the role of the real mediation in the deduction moves from value to prices of production. From a very different perspective, the same split between production, analyzed in terms of the, quote, law of value, end quote, as precipitated in the postulate, the circulation distribution, analyzed in terms of prices of production, parenthesis, or whatever, in parenthesis, that is, in terms of alternative, quote, laws of exchange, end quote, reappears. The same that was peculiar in Vianello's standpoint and was criticized by Napoleoni. The notions that should connect the two spheres, the value of money and the value of labor power, assume the nature of ex post accounting identities and cannot provide the desired theoretical bridge. We can now turn our attention to the essays in this issue. Although the authors exhibit a number of differences, they share a common inspiration. Footnote: the reader is warned that what follows is a personal view of the content and implications of the reading of Marx embodied in these writings, a view that is also biased by a certain way of reconstructing old and new controversies on the labor theory of value. My comments, therefore, do not represent or bind the other authors of the paper here collected. End footnote. As in the case of the new interpretation,
dinner's ready.
Okay. Emphasis is placed on the monetary nature of the capitalist economy, and the debate on value theory is tackled directly at the macroeconomic level. Another point of contact is the centrality of the cycle of money capital. Indeed, on this point, the Italian authors seem more consistent than the new interpretation. Following advances by Schumpeter and by the Keynes of the Treatise on Money, parenthesis, but more generally following the heterodox monetary macroeconomics of the first half of this century, inspired by Wicksel's Interest in Prices, end parenthesis, the authors here collected stress that, in the capitalist economy, which they believe is the only true monetary economy, the money starting the monetary circuit and playing the role of means of payment cannot be a commodity money. It has rather to be interpreted as credit money with no intrinsic value. One second. Sorry about that. Where the hell was I? The authors here collected stress that in the capitalist economy, which the authors collected here believe is the only true monetary economy, the money starting the monetary circuit and playing the role of means of payment cannot be a commodity money. The money starting the monetary circuit has, rather, to be interpreted as credit money with no intrinsic value. Footnote: if money is a commodity, money must be produced. But if capitalist production needs to be financed, initial money cannot be a commodity. End footnote. More precisely, it is a promise of payment by a third agent, nowadays a bank, employed by the purchaser to definitely settle up the transaction with the seller. Thus, there are three basic agents in a macroeconomic setting without the state: the money capitalist, the banking system, the industrial capitalist, firms as a whole, and the wage workers. The firm sector, which produces intermediate goods and capital goods within the firm sector's self, needs to buy only one single input, quote, from outside, end quote, namely labor power. At the beginning of the monetary circuit, it will therefore need to be granted by the banks an initial finance to the money wage bill. The value of the money anticipated as capital is equal to that money's purchasing power, which at this stage before production can only be expressed as the number of workers bought in the labor market. During production, these workers perform a given amount of living labor. In other words, once the transactions on the labor market, between firms and workers, and on the money market, between firms and banks, have been simultaneously settled, and once the monetary wage bill and employment have both been fixed, the intermediate phase of the monetary circuit, namely production, takes place. The use value of labor power is now exploited within the valorization process. The commodity output emerging from the production may be divided in two. On the one hand are the wage goods, or the commodities that the aggregate of the industrial capitalist actually will make available to workers on the commodity market. On the other hand are all the other commodities not sold to workers. Let us call them the profit goods, including capital goods and luxury goods, Such profit goods are exchanged among firms, and those profit goods remain available to the firm sector, even if their ownership is nominally transferred to workers through the sale of some financial instruments on the financial market. What is relevant is that the aggregate real consumption of the workers is de facto decided by the capitalist class, banks and firms together, Marx, however, decides to assume in most of his analysis that firms grant to workers the, quote, subsistence, end quote, of real, Marx, however, decided to assume in most of his analysis that firms grant to workers the, quote, subsistence, end quote, real wage bundle as a social given. The last phase of the monetary circuit is represented by the final exchange on the commodity market, and by the firm's repayment to the banks of initial finance, with the integral or partial destruction of the money created at the beginning. The payment of interest from the firms to the banking system implies that the latter appropriates a part of the surplus produced. Footnote: a complete picture of the monetary circuit along these lines is presented by Graziani in 1994 without ever mentioning Marx. Note, however, that according to Graziani, the Wicksell-Schumpeter-Keynes tradition is a, quote, underground Marxist stream, end quote, throughout this century, which, though not explicitly endorsing his value and exploitation theory, nevertheless followed Marx's general approach to the capitalist process as a cycle of money capital. The essays in this volume show how this, quote, bourgeois, end quote, tradition may be implicitly seen as confirming Marx's conclusions about value and exploitation. End footnote. Although the terminology adopted in this summary does not belong in the Marxist tradition, the description of the capitalist process strikingly confirms many of Marx's insights. Here, in fact, the attribution of the new value produced, parenthesis, the attribution of the new value produced to, parenthesis, the living, and parenthesis, labor, parenthesis, of the wage workers, and parenthesis, is not simply an assumption but the conclusion of an argument. Within a coherent macromonetary perspective, like the macromonetary perspective pursued in the first volume of Capital, internal transactions within the firm sector must disappear and cannot be the source of any new value. Hence, the only external relation from which the capitalist class can get an increase in the value of initial capital is that with labor power. Because of their privileged access to bank money, firms are able to decide the real composition of output through the sectoral allocation of employment. The surplus commodity product and the surplus value are then nothing but the result of a surplus labor over and above the necessary labor contained in wage goods. Here we have a resemblance to Marx's position in the Grundrisse, where capital as dead labor can valorize itself, subsuming the only not capital, not dead labor element in the process, namely living labor. Another interesting feature of these papers is that they shift the attention from money as means of exchange or as store of value at the end of the circuit to money as means of payment at the beginning of the circuit. They are therefore able to answer the question, quote, how money enters, end quote, the capitalist circuit, a question that is seldom, if ever, posed by Marxists, parenthesis, or by neoclassicals or standard Keynesians, end parenthesis. And at the same time, these papers focus on the role of money in the, quote, constitution, end quote, of the fundamental class relation between capital and labor on the labor market and in production, before final exchange. Let me examine more closely the consequences of this asymmetric power, gained by industrial capital thanks to its access to money capital as finance to production. Workers may spend money only after workers have been lucky enough to sell their labor power and have got a money wage on the labor market, and only after those workers have objectified their living labor in production. On the commodity market, their only choice is whether to spend the whole or just a part of their money income. If they save, this is merely a postponement of consumption. In any case, while the individual saver may have the chance to shape the time profile of her or his own consumption, the working class is constrained by the autonomous choices of the firm sector about the real composition of the net product. Indeed, because they get bank financing before producing and selling commodities, firms are free to decide where to assign and exploit the workers these firms have the right to dispose of. In short, capitalists as a class are able to determine the level and composition of output before entering the commodity market. Therefore, the relevance of money in this approach is given by the fact that money capital is the carrier of a command over living labor. This same feature explains why, for the working class as a whole, just because the wage bill is paid in money on the labor market, the real wage is given ex ante relative to exchange on the commodity market, and why it is dependent on what happens in production, parenthesis, and in Marx's assumption that firms grant workers, quote, subsistence, end quote, the real wage is even known before production, end parenthesis. In this way, we reach conclusions very different from the new interpretation. And I guess I should say that new interpretation is capitalized, so it's applying to a specific interpretation. Where money enters the picture as the general equivalent on the commodity market, and where the real wage is taken is given before circulation. These conclusions, of course, are not incompatible with the new interpretation, ex post accounting identities. They merely spring from an alternative interpretation of the development of Marx's argument. One can easily grasp the consequences for the interpretation of the transformation of this alternative view. Among the data, we should find the purchasing power of money capital, and the real wage of the working class. The industrial capital, thanks to the advance of money capital to acquire labor power, has been able to extract a given amount of living labor and to determine the wage bundle of the working class in the sphere of production. Hence, those two quantities, total direct labor and the real wage, cannot change. Whatever the price system, with a given technique, the necessary labor embodied in wage goods is also given before final exchange, parenthesis. Again, if one follows Marx's assumption about the, quote, subsistence, end quote, granted to workers, and with a good technique, necessary labor embodied in wage goods is known even before production, end parenthesis. Exploitation of the use value of labor power, quote, adds, end quote, to the necessary labor congealed in the parenthesis, quote, subsistence, end quote, parenthesis, wage bundle, a surplus labor, which is a function of class struggle in production. The surplus labor, parenthesis, potential, and parenthesis, surplus value. This surplus labor is, parenthesis, potential, and parenthesis, surplus value. Footnote. In most of the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx explicitly assumes that all the value produced is sold on the market. That is, circulation actualizes potential value and potential surplus value. End footnote. Therefore, the accurate measure of the class relation between capitalists and workers is given by the rate of surplus value expressed in terms of exchange values. What is caused by prices diverging from exchange values is merely a duplication of the value of the labor power and a fetishistic concealment of the real relation emerging from production. For workers to consume the same wage goods with prices different from values, the wage bill must of course be evaluated at the ruling price in order to keep the purchasing power of money as capital in line with the actual situation. But, to repeat, the real wage bundle is known before exchange, parenthesis, if not, given Marx's assumption, even before production, end parenthesis. And then the labor required to produce it is also known. We have then 2 values of labor power at once. A value of labor power as the labor content of the real wage, and a value of labor power as the labor equivalent of the money wage. Both concepts are relative to the actual setting that is the object of analysis. The latter value of labor power expresses in labor representing terms the former, which is unaffected by any change in ruling prices due to different distribution of the capitalist surplus. Of course, this fetishistic duplication is irrelevant to capitalist reality, and has very important effects on the aggregate profit-wage ratio. Among them is the violation of Marx's identity between surplus value, parenthesis, the, quote, crystal, end quote, of labor embodied in the profit goods remaining to the capitalist class, end parenthesis, and profit, parenthesis, the labor, quote, commanded, end quote, by profit goods, that is, the labor represented in the money acquiring them, end parenthesis. But this violation is quite natural and raises no theoretical problems. Indeed, it could not be otherwise. The living labor extracted by capital as a whole is unchanged, as is the necessary labor embodied in the wage bundle. However, the evaluation of this bundle at prices that diverge from exchange values means that the branches of production selling wage goods get a higher, parenthesis, lower, end parenthesis, share of direct labor than that actually expended, and that the branches of production selling profit goods get a lower, higher, and share of direct labor than that actually expended. The profit-wage ratio in labor terms may thus be lower, higher, than the rate of surplus value as defined above. Nevertheless, from the macro point of view, nothing has happened. Workers still get back the time share of living labor congealed in the wage goods they consume, and total capital still appropriates the same share of living labor congealed in private goods. Following this vision, one can paraphrase what Graziani writes in one of the two essays included here to affirm the price determination in commodity exchange takes place after the process described by Marx's value theory. A theory of class exploitation in commodity production is already completed. Marx's aim is to explain the source of surplus value, to understand where capitalist profits are generated. Marx finds the proper means to that end by grafting Smith onto Riccardo, or, more precisely, by his original use of Smith's notion of labor commanded in such a way that it does not contradict the latter's notion of embodied labor. Smith's labor commanded becomes, in Marx, money as capital, or money buying labor power and allowing industrial capital to command living labor in production. Footnote. This notion of labor commanded is different from that of labor commanded referred to above when speaking of the new interpretation. There the labor commanded was the objectified labor represented in money as general equivalent that commodities were able to get on the commodity market. Here, labor commanded refers to the workers as bearers of labor power, potential living labor, who are bought by money as capital in the labor market. The compulsion to work by industrial capital actualizes this potential in the immediate production process. End footnote. Let me reread that last sentence. Marx finds the proper means to that end by grafting Smith onto Riccardo, or more precisely, by Marx's original use of Smith's notion of labor commanded in such a way that Smith's notion of labor commanded does not contradict Riccardo's notion of embodied labor. Smith's labor commanded becomes, in Marx, money as capital, or money buying labor power and allowing industrial capital to command living labor in production. The use value of labor power is labor in becoming, that is, living labor that can be, and really is, prolonged beyond the labor content of workers' consumption. Once the stage of dead labor is reached, that is Riccardo's object of inquiry, the given quantity of direct labor is already split between the two different classes according to the outcome of class struggle in production. The division of the social working day between necessary and surplus labor is then given before circulation. This partition marks as is doubled and distorted by the secondary apportionment of direct labor among individual firms because of the form value assumes in final exchange. This is, by the division of direct labor as expressed in money on the commodity market, when prices depart from exchange values. Thus, price determination as a feedback effect on how capitalists divide the money they get on final exchange, but it is irrelevant to the exploitation of labor power resulting from the antagonistic social determination of living labor and of workers' consumption. The total amount of surplus value for capital as a whole, as opposed to the working class, is already determined in production. It is the quantity of direct labor embodied in profit goods. Instead, the money profits realized by the branches producing profit goods in competition, with the branches producing wage goods are a variable dependent on price setting. It is the quantity of labor represented by these money profits. With a given configuration of production, prices are known, therefore. The labor represented in money spent in buying profit goods and the labor represented in the money spent buying wage goods are also set. With prices diverging from values, the labor represented partition of the new value added among branches of production does not correspond with the labor embodied partition in the real output gained by classes. The answer this approach gives to traditional Marxism and to neo-Ricardianism comes through a recovery of the monetary dimension of Marx's argument that still essentially refers to the, quote, mean, end quote, term concept of exchange value. The concept is indeed the pivot of how the basic class relation is described. The point is not often explicit but is all the same. One can go beyond the theses proposed in these essays. Marx's value theory, to provide the theoretical explanation of the origin of surplus value, must at the same time depict the relation between values and prices as one of, quote, real mediation, end quote, of value, from value to prices. Footnote. Marx is here following Hegel, quote, mediation is a beginning and a having advanced to a second, in such a way that this second is only there because one has come to it from something that is other vis-a-vis this second, end quote. Hegel. End footnote. Marx's systematic presentation does not take capital as granted, but rather wants to ground the production of value as the product of surplus value. To this end, it has to avoid beginning with already constituted capital. However, Marx initially assumes that the inputs, parenthesis, which in a true macro framework reduced to labor power, end parenthesis, are bought as not yet capitalist commodities at their exchange values. The prolongation of living labor beyond necessary labor generates surplus labor as potential, end parenthesis, surplus value, which when related to the whole of capital advance becomes profits. Whence the necessity of the introduction of the notion of the profit rate. In this argument, which is developed in the first volume of Capital, there is, so to speak, quote, before, and a quote, after, a cause and an effect. Before there is labor, after there is capital. However, once capital is built up and one has to go backward and subsume labor power under capital, giving its due to the capitalist process as a circulation process. This reversal, which is also developed in the first volume of Capital and goes into a spiral in the second and third volumes, is never perfect. Although capital produces and reproduces the systemic conditions forcing workers to alienate their labor power, it cannot escape its ultimate dependence on labor as the source of surplus value. Hence the necessity to exploit workers in production as the bearers of living labor. The transformation is, in a sense, no more than the expression of the key insight of Marxian theory. The mere possibility of valorization never means ipso facto valorization's reality. First, capital has to be, quote, constituted. The, quote, making, end quote, of capital is both a logical and a historical process that actually takes place in each capitalist circuit and cannot be assumed as done once and for all. The formation of capital is reconstructed by Marx, tracing step by step the inclusion of living labor and dead labor. Afterwards, once capital is already constituted and production is completed, circulation actualizes value and redistributes it according to certain price rules. The deduction of prices from values makes the way capital produces depend on how it has been produced. The dominance of value production within capital as a totality, embracing production and circulation, manifests itself in two ways. One, because circulation can only actualize in the value form the potential new value coming out from the living labor expended in production. 2. Because circulation can only affect the labor represented, but not the labor embodied in the wage bundle. Both ways employ the notion of exchange value. 1. Because of the stipulation that the price of net output is equal to its exchange value, and 2. Because the value of labor power continues to be defined in exchange value terms in a meaningful sense, even in a situation where prices are no longer proportional to exchange values, though this definition is in contradictory unity with the other definition of the value of labor power as the transformed price of the wage bundle. Footnote. Napoleoni's unwillingness to eliminate exchange value as the middle link between absolute value and prices of production is then vindicated, though through a partially different chain of reasoning. End footnote. And that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.